Oh, that's right. Oh, wait, let me get my tie up. Well, I was water out.
My share of the agency.
Do you remember the
Yeah, so yourself, Commissioner Harris, Commissioner Davis, Commissioner Oliver, Commissioner Adams, Commissioner Solomon, Commissioner
Yeah.
Shelton, are you in orientation? Good afternoon. Let me welcome everybody to the Water Quality Committee meeting. My name is Marion Deerhake. I'm chair, and Happy New Year to everyone. Glad to see you here. We are going to begin by announcing North Carolina General Statute 138A15. It mandates that at the beginning of any meeting of the board, the chair is reminding all members of their duty to avoid conflicts of interest under this subchapter. The chair also shall inquire as to whether there is any known conflict of interest with respect to any matters before the board at this time.
Madam Chair?
Commissioner McAdams.
Madam Chair, I'm afraid I do have a conflict on the one action item. Toll Brothers is a client of my firm, so I will step out here.
Thank you. Anyone else? I see no other hands raised, so thank you very much. And I will take this opportunity in a new year to welcome two new members. Commissioner Duggan, who is joining us from other committee service in previous years, and Commissioner Solomon, who has exchanged places with Commissioner Carter. So thank you both gentlemen for serving. Glad to have you with us. Our next item is the approval of the draft minutes for the November 9, 2022 meeting. Hopefully you have had an opportunity to look at those. Do I hear a motion to approve, or do you have any changes that you want to request?
Madam Chair, I move approval of the minutes.
Thank you, Commissioner McAdams. May I have a second, please? Thank you, Commissioner Solomon. Any other discussion about the meeting minutes? If not, may I have a vote to approve the motion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We have one action item and one information item on our agenda today. So the first action item, the only action item, is a request for a major variance from the Jordan Lake Riparian Area Protection Rule by Toll NC, Roman numeral 2, LP, for the Pines Avenue crossing at 0 Carlier Drive, Apex, North Carolina. And it will be presented by Sue Homewood in our Commission Board of Resources. But before she begins, I will ask our council to refresh your memory about the conditions which will be offered.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for the record, as you had stated earlier, Commissioner McAdams has been advised that he had a conflict of interest and has chosen to leave the meeting to ensure that he is not influencing voting in any way. So I wanted that to be noted for the record. Good afternoon now to you all. It's nice to see you for another year in 2023. As Chair Deerhake mentioned, I wanted to provide to you the quasi-judicial instructions for proceeding with these matters because the matter in front of you is in fact quasi-judicial. Many of you have heard me say this again, but since the beginning of others have given you these instructions previously, but since it's the beginning of the year, it's not a bad idea to get a quick reminder for how to proceed with these matters. So with the various requests, the EMC is acting in its quasi-judicial capacity as opposed to your quasi-legislative role, such as in adopting rules. In order to give the matter fair consideration, you're first required to determine whether you have a conflict of interest. One member already having identified that and taking proper action to recuse themselves. But you also must determine whether you have an impermissible legal bias. And what an impermissible legal bias requires recusal on the matter, as it would be a predisposition to decide a cause or issue in a certain way, and which does not leave the mind perfectly open to persuasion. You're not disqualified merely because you have taken a particular position on a policy issue arising in the matter, absent of showing that you are incapable of judging the controversy solely based on the record in front of you and fairly and fully on that record. You must be able to also set aside any prior knowledge or preconceptions concerning the event or the request itself, and as I mentioned earlier, make sure that your consideration is based solely on the matter before you. As Ms. Homewood will inform you, and as you have all received, the matter first went through the town of Holly Springs, who have already made their findings of fact and conclusions, and so you'll be proceeding based on that record and that record only. And I'm happy to take any questions, Madam Chair, if anyone have any.
Just one slight revision, I think it's town of Apex.
Oh, sorry, Apex. Sorry, my mistake. My mistake.
I do have a question, Councilor. It's with the term of the second condition you talked about. There are three options that were provided to the town of Apex, and they made a land use ruling in that. That's really not germane to this conversation today. This is a buffer conversation, not a preference of what's already been approved locally.
Well, it's a consideration of what the request is in front of you, which is a buffer variance. And so if there are three options in the, if those three options are included in the record in front of you, they're perfectly open to being discussed or considered, but it has to be on the record. And you'll have to make the determination yourself of whether that is germane to the decision to determine whether to grant or deny the variance.
Try to ask a clarifying question.
Sure.
One of the reasons that I understand the spirit, and I'm not a lawyer like several of you guys are, but that we have even variances in this is when we adopt an ordinance in the past, we want to prevent a taking. So the variance offers property owners the relief
Correct.
to not be impacted. So that's really what we're considering today when we start talking about a variance is it appropriate to deviate for a property owner right? Or I shouldn't say it that way.
Right, so the considerations that you have to make, there are factors that are in the buffer variance rules. And I don't have them in front of me right now, but I can get to them really quickly. But it's those requirements and considerations in the rules that you're deciding on.
Okay.
And whether the town of Apex has made the adequate considerations in their recommendation to this commission, which are either voting up or voting down.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome, Ms. Homewood. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Happy New Year. I am Sue Homewood with the Division of Water Resources, and I am here to present a request for a major variance from the Jordan Lake Riparian Area Protection Rule for the Pines at Wake Crossing in Apex.
Put the microphone a little closer to you. I'm not sure it's carrying on. Thank you.
I don't think it gets any closer, but I'll try and lean forward. My presentation today will be in three parts. I'm going to give you a very short snippet of the history of the project and the situation at the Pines at Wake Crossing. talk about the Town of Apex Unified Development Ordinance, UDO's variance process, and then go into the Jordan Lake Riparian Buffer Rules variance process. So again, just a little snippet about the project. In 2007, the Pines at Wake Crossing subdivision plan was approved locally. In 2011, the Jordan Lake Riparian Buffer Rules were adopted into the Town of Apex's ordinance. So the Jordan Lake Buffer Rules came into effect in 2009, but part of that process was the local governments were given time to revise their ordinances and adopt them. So in the Town of Apex, that was finalized in 2011. So that's when the buffer rules went into effect in the Town of Apex. The culvert that we're going to be talking about was constructed in the time frame of 2012, 2013. And in 2017, the final subdivision plat was recorded for the Pines at Wake Crossing. So the reason for the request for Jordan Lake buffer variance today is related to a FEMA violation. So the culvert that we're going to be talking about was installed within a non-encroachment area. Sorry, the slide says floodway, and I had that term incorrect. It's the non-encroachment area, but it is related to FEMA violations or FEMA regulations. There was some confusion at the time of planning relating to mapping and where those non-encroachment areas were. So the subdivision did not receive a FEMA conditional letter of map revision or a CLOMAR prior to construction. So that's what created the FEMA violation. FEMA does not have a mechanism to consider approving actions after the fact. That's a term that's often used in regulatory permitting, after the fact approvals. My understanding is that FEMA just does not have that mechanism available to them. So once the violation was identified, the applicant and the Town of Apex conducted some meetings with FEMA to discuss possible resolutions to the violation. After those meetings, FEMA issued a letter detailing the remedial options that were brought to them by the applicant and the Town of Apex. And that time frame was the end of 2021. So there were 3 options that were presented to FEMA as potential resolutions to the violation. And this is for just historical context of how we ended up with the request in front of you today. The 3 options that were identified were to remove the existing culvert, which would create 2 dead-end streets. And the applicant states that that's not a viable option because first, it would not accommodate first responder and vehicle turnaround, which is required on local roads. It would also require removing all the utilities that are within that road above the culvert and relaying them. One of those would be the stormwater drainage, and it would actually cut off the stormwater parts of the subdivision from the stormwater treatment system, which is on the other side of the road. So a second option that they considered was adding another culvert next to this culvert to add for additional storm capacity, so more floodwater could be passed during storm events. And the applicant indicated that that wasn't a viable option for many of the same reasons. There would still be a significant temporary impact to the roadway while that was being done, and it still had the problem of the utilities are in the roadway, and there wouldn't be a way to insert that second culvert without disturbing those utilities. It would also disturb some of the existing stream, buffer, and wetland adjacent to the area. So the third option, and the one that is presented as part of the variance, is to excavate an area adjacent to the culvert, both upstream and downstream, in order to provide more flood capacity during a storm event and lower the base flood, the rise that was created by the existing culvert. And according to the applicant, this is the viable option that they are requesting a variance for today. So just a little bit of the location. As you can see on these, this is the USGS map and the printed soil survey map. So the Jordan Lake buffer rules apply to streams that show up on one of these maps, and this stream shows up on both. It is a named stream. Here's the aerial view where you can see the culvert has already been installed and the road is connected, and then just a schematic of the culvert itself on the right there. It's just a standard roadway culvert, similar to all subdivisions that we see. This is a map of the proposed impact. So the hatched and the shaded areas are where they are proposing to construct excavation. So they would lower the ground elevation. The first inner two areas are zone 1 and 2 of the Jordan Lake buffer. The outer hatched area is a town buffer beyond that. There is also a small wetland in this area, so they will be excavating a wetland area. The total buffer impacts that they are proposing is about 1/3 of an acre. Zone 1, which is closest to the stream, would be about 9,000 square feet, and Zone 2 is about 5,000 square feet. And this is the area that was determined would be sufficient excavation to address the elevation rise during the flood. These are some pictures of what the area looks like. As you can see, it's a pretty mature buffer area that will be excavated. That area on either side of the stream, the banks would be lowered. The stream would not be impacted, but the adjacent floodplain would be lowered. So the town of Apex has gone through their process in accordance with their Unified Development Ordinance, their UDO. The current town UDO that this was reviewed under was adopted in March of 2021. The Jordan Lake riparian buffer rules are incorporated into the town's current ordinance. That's in Section 6 of their ordinance. The applicant applied to the town for a major variance pursuant to the standards set forth in the town's UDO. So that's Section 2.3.8D of the town's UDO. And the applicant applied in April of 2022 for that variance. The Board of Adjustments of the town of Apex made a finding of fact in accordance with the language in their UDO and approved the variance application pursuant to those standards in June of 2022. And that documentation was forwarded to the division for review and to proceed here to the Water Quality Committee. So just a short note that the most current version of the Town of Apex ordinance does not contain the exact same language as the variance standards in the Jordan Buffer Rules. So the town's findings of facts is in accordance with the language set out in their UDO. So these are the conditions that they reviewed upon the applicant's request for a variance. One of those was that the unnecessary hardship would result from the strict application of the ordinance. It should not be necessary to demonstrate that in the absence of a variance, no reasonable use can be made from the property. So the town's findings were that strict interpretation of the regulation would restrict any activity on the site. The existing conditions of the culvert are in violation of FEMA, and the violation remaining at risk would be a hardship to the insurance program, the flood insurance program. The town's next hardship is that the hardship results from conditions that are peculiar to the property, such as location, size, or topography. And the hardship is resulting from personal circumstances or from conditions common to the neighborhood may not be the basis for granting a variance. And this existing conditions of the culvert and the related infrastructure is a unique situation. The Watershed Protection Overlay District was applied to this site after the initial development was reviewed, and it encompasses this property. So the FEMA violation is unique to this subject property. Moving along in the town of Apex's UDO language, they are required to consider the hardship did not result from actions taken by the applicant or the property owner. And the FEMA violation was not created by the initial design. It was not a result of actions by the applicant. It's a result of culmination and some timing of a series of regulations. And then they are required to determine whether the variance request is consistent with their UDO, whether it is consistent with the spirit, purpose, and intent of the ordinance, and ensures public safety is secured and substantial justice is achieved. And the town found that the applicant had demonstrated that the remedy is environmentally sensitive with the least harm to provide a corrective action to a FEMA violation. So again, the town's ordinance language is a little bit different from the Jordan Buffer Rules. So the town did actually make a conclusion of law that the applicant did meet the burden of proof and establish facts to show that the standards for granting a variance from the town's ordinance were met. So now step into talking about the Jordan Lake buffer variance process, and the citation is listed there on the slide. In the Jordan Lake riparian buffer rules, the variance language is set out so that for any variance request, the local government shall make a preliminary findings of fact as to whether there are practical difficulties and unnecessary hardships that prevent compliance with the buffer rule. It also states that if the local government has determined that a major variance request meets the requirements, then it shall prepare a preliminary finding and submit it to the commission for approval. And that the commission shall review preliminary findings on major variance requests and shall take one of the following actions: approve with conditions and stipulations, or deny. So as I said, the town's process, their UDO actually directed them to make a final findings of fact and a conclusion of law. So that's what we have in the package. The rule says it should be a preliminary finding of fact, and that the EMC and Water Quality Committee makes that final decision. So since the town's ordinance didn't match up exactly with the language in the Jordan Buffer Rule, the division went through the requirements of the Jordan Buffer Rule and tabulated them for your consideration. So I'll go through the division's findings upon review of the application. So the Jordan Rule says if the applicant complies with the provisions of the rule, he or she can secure no reasonable return from nor make reasonable use of their property. This development of the site has already occurred. The actions are actually required to resolve a FEMA violation and not related to reasonable return from the property or reasonable use of the property. The next one is the hardships results from application of the rule to the property rather than from other factors such as deed restrictions or other hardships. This hardship doesn't result from application of this rule. It results from a FEMA violation. This is a unique situation that doesn't quite line up with all the language in the variance or in the buffer rule. So following along to item 3, the hardship is due to the physical nature of the applicant's property, such as size, shape, topography, such that compliance with the provisions of the rule would not allow reasonable use of the property. Again, the development is already built. It's hard to say about reasonable use, but the hardship isn't due to the physical nature of the property. It's due to the unique situation of the FEMA violation. The applicant did not cause the hardship by knowingly or unknowingly violating the rule. There is no violation of the buffer rule at this site. The applicant is requesting a variance so that they can conduct the resolution activity. Item 5 is the applicant did not purchase the property after the effective date of the Jordan Buffer Rule. The applicant did purchase the property from another development. However, the project was designed and approved prior to the effective date of the rule. And lastly, the hardship is rare or unique to the applicant's property, and the FEMA violation is unique to the subject property and this culvert location specifically. The last 2 items in the Jordan Lake buffer rules regarding a variance state that for any variance request, the local government shall make a finding of fact as to whether the variance is in harmony with the general purpose and intent of the state's riparian buffer protection program. The Town of Apex Board of Adjustment's conclusion of law clearly states that they felt the applicant had demonstrated that the remedy is environmentally sensitive with the least harm to provide corrective measures and to maintain the insurance status. And lastly, for any variance request, the local government shall make a finding of fact as to whether granting the variance, the public safety and welfare have been assured and water quality has been protected, substantial justice has been done. The town's conclusion of law doesn't include a specific statement as to that. I will close by saying that the division, if the Water Quality Committee approves this request, the division recommends that it be approved with a condition that mitigation be provided for the impacts in accordance with our consolidated buffer mitigation rule. That concludes the presentation. Happy to answer questions. We also have representatives here from the town as well as from the applicant in case I am unable to answer any complicated questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you just leave the next to the last slide up on the screen for us to think about?
That one?
Yes.
Okay.
Commissioner Monas, yes, I'll entertain questions now.
Thanks for the presentation. This is an interesting situation. And appreciate them asking before doing, so that's great. I was a little confused about the initial miscommunication with FEMA. Do we know, it just said they did not receive the FEMA plumber. Is there any more detail about like what that means? Was the development supposed to have asked? Was FEMA supposed to have reached out? How did that did not receive occur?
That's a great question, and I have had it explained to me 3 or 4 times, but I think that Adam with the town would do a better job answering it than I would. You could just state your
Sure.
name.
Adam Stevenson, I'm the floodplain administrator. So the non-encroachment areas, they are essentially invisible floodways. So it's just not drawn on the map. We missed it on the staff level. The engineers for the developer missed it. At the time, it was, I believe, the only non-encroachment area in the corporate limits of Apex. So looking at the map, you see floodplain. Oh, there's no floodway. They don't need a CLOMAR, so just got missed by both parties.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Other questions?
Yeah, actually, follow up to that. How are the non-encroachment areas developed? Like, how are they?
So FEMA they have a variety of levels of their flood study depths. This is considered a limited detail study. So it's really a matter of just a less expensive, less in-depth study to establish all the floodplain information.
But I guess, forgive me if I'm asking obvious questions, but the non-encroachment you said is not part of the floodway or is not part of the floodplain?
It is part of the floodplain.
Floodplain, okay. But is it an extension of the floodway? Like the regulations that apply to floodways also apply to
It's in lieu of the floodway. So floodway, you can look at the map, and today you can go online and you can just point and click, and it give you the information. This was prior to the current Frizz system. This is the online system now. At the time, you had to open up a 3-ring binder about this thick, turn to the stream station in question, and actually read tabulated X number of feet from stream centerline right and left. And so that tabulation in a hard copy 3-ring binder, that was the only way to discover the non-encroachment area.
And where is that held, that binder?
Well, that would be at the town level. I had that information available, but had not dealt with it to that point. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Sure.
Question.
Yes, Commissioner Solomon.
Another question for the town, if I could, please. It appears, and we don't have a calculation, so we don't know, but it looks like they've taken, they've created storage by digging out part of the floodway here, the basin, in lieu of putting a double culvert in, right? So there's a calculation that's been done that y'all have seen. My question is, there's a calculation that's been done that your engineers have seen that says this is the exact amount of earth that needs to be moved out.
Let me say that these alternatives were not provided by FEMA. FEMA did not provide any alternatives. It was put on the applicant, the developer, to come up with ideas. So these were all somewhat arbitrary because the impacts are not to any individual property owners. The increase in the base flood caused by this street crossing, that base flood level is contained entirely within this development open space. It doesn't even encroach, this is single family residential, it doesn't even encroach lots within the development, let alone structures.
Okay, follow on that. Why are we digging it up then?
Because we are hopeful that FEMA has told us that if they take this action, they will clear the violation with the town. If this is denied, FEMA may clear this violation and issue a LOMAR, a letter of map revision. So FEMA, they could process the LOMAR today, close this matter with the town, and we not have to take any action. I was told they don't like to let these things go because it sends the wrong message to the development community. In my view, it's just a matter of they don't have any process by which to deal with skipping part of the process, the CLOMAR prior to the LOMAR. You get the conditional letter of map revision, get it approved. I was also told if this was submitted today, new construction, as a CLOMAR, it would be approved exactly as it's constructed. All of the increases are contained within the development site, the property, and CLOMARs are routinely issued that cause increases on adjacent properties upstream. I've had one within the last year or two that the property owner wasn't happy about, but because it wasn't increasing the base flood on an insurable structure, it was just on the property, it was approved. That's not even the case here. This is entirely within the development site, in the open space, within the stream buffer, doesn't encroach the individual residential lots. So from a floodplain management perspective and impacts to owners, residents, this doesn't accomplish anything. It decreases the rise created by the road crossing by, it's about a foot.
And that was going to be my question, because again, my background, local government and an engineer, so
Yeah.
what is the threat to the road from overtopping it? Because we don't have the routing
No.
study or the
No,
no-rise study or anything.
from a flooding perspective, there's nothing to be gained. It's my view this is punitive. FEMA wants the applicant to have to do something, and there's no mitigation set up in the floodplain regulations to deal with the fact that, well, they just didn't get the CLOMAR in advance. And in this case, the construction, the design is not the issue. It's a process issue.
So,
Any of the other members have questions? Commissioner Duffy?
they have issued the CLOMARs post-violations. Is that what you're saying? I mean, FEMA has the ability to issue that LOMAR.
LOMAR, yeah, two different
Yeah.
things. LOMARs they could issue. It's my understanding they don't issue CLOMARs after the fact. CLOMAR being the conditional, well, it's already built. The CLOMAR doesn't really serve its intended purpose. They would just have to issue the LOMAR at this point. And they have it. It has been submitted to them. They're sitting on it. They're refusing to review and process it until some kind of action is taken. I proposed to them, what if other agencies, because of the environmental impacts, don't allow this? And I was led to believe they may process the LOMAR, they may drop the whole thing if that's the case. I don't have that in writing, so I can't for sure say today if this is denied, they'll clear it. But the risk for the town is they have the power to put us on probation, suspend us from the NFIP.
Which is a big stick to carry.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the aerial maps by chance? Where the culvert drawn is? Yes, that one right there. So looking at that, the circle around where the culvert is that all community open space? So for instance, is that section going to be developed in the future with additional lots, or what is around there?
No.
To the north of it, or as the way the picture is sitting, if you look to the north of it, there's significant wooded area and open space and that type of thing. Is that dedicated open space or?
Yes, to my knowledge, all of what you see can no longer be developed any further.
Okay. And upstream development, as you talked about before, the upstream development can have an impact on the turbidity and the flows as you go along anyways. So what might be considered a remedy now, based upon whatever the flows come in the future, the remedy that you're suggesting now, or that's being suggested now, would that take into account additional flows?
Well, and the other thing I consider is the temporary nature of this proposed excavation. We all know in a matter of time, it's just going to, the stream is going to fill back in, and whatever's gained, very small amount gained as far as storage capacity. And again, it doesn't have any real floodplain management value, in my view, as the community floodplain administrator. I also see it as it's temporary.
How much above the base flood elevation, 1 foot are you? Or is this?
Well,
I apologize.
So consider this site pre-development, no road. Then you stick the road in with the culvert. You got the you're squeezing everything. Immediately at the road crossing upstream, I think it's 5.7 feet. But that, as you go further upstream, dissipates, and it dissipates to zero within this residential development.
Is it within that open space?
Within the open space, exactly.
So your load is being accommodated within that open space and it's not impacting any structures?
Correct. We don't have a visual, but the best, I wish we had the slide, the best visual shows the as-built condition, what's out there today, the base flood footprint. It abuts some of the properties, but it doesn't even encroach, the backyards of these residential properties.
Not even the garage is impacted?
No, not the swing set.
I have 2 questions for council. We got a chance.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think my question can be directed to Ms. Homewood, but you're welcome to come back if we need you to
Sure.
answer. Thank you very, very much. This is all very helpful. Looking at the record, I see reference to this being an acceptable option, but the letter that I saw from FEMA only discussed the first 2 options. It did not discuss the third option and what FEMA's position was on the options before us today.
It's my understanding that FEMA is accepting of any of those.
So the last conference call we had with FEMA, where in the letter they had asked for the additional culvert, and we, staff, pushed back on that because of all the issues it causes, not to mention at the time I think it was estimated at about $800,000 cost. The FEMA rep backpedaled and said that they would consider the excavation. So that's why I feel like these options, FEMA did not propose any of them, and they're somewhat arbitrary.
You said they would consider. You mean you're saying that they would accept it?
I was led to believe they would, but you're correct. I don't have that in writing. Right, correct.
That's I think very important. Before
Certainly.
we make such a drastic decision such
Right.
as this. The other thing that I'm interested in is the determination of environmental sensitivity by the town. I guess what you're meaning, what the town means by environmentally sensitive means that it's protective. But to me, I did not see a comparison of the actual impacts, the environmental impacts from the 3 options. To me, that would be important in weighing and making a decision about the 3 and justifying the choice of the 3rd option.
Well,
Can you also share with us, I know this is about the buffer and not about the stream, but it is indirectly an impact to the stream. But how many linear feet of stream are we talking about? Is that okay to ask that question? council?
I'll answer that second question first. So there will be no impacts to the stream
No
itself.
physical impact, but the
Correct.
water quality impact.
The stream will continue to flow in its exact same footprint with the same amount of impact, of quality. What this does is excavate an area on the floodplain. So when the stream is out of its banks and on the floodplain, there'll be more capacity there to hold floodwaters. But the stream on a dry day will look identical. The impacts are to the floodplain where there is a buffer and a wetland, but the stream won't be impacted at all.
I know physically the stream will not be, but by changing the surroundings, the buffer area, doesn't that have some influence on the runoff that goes to the stream? At least during construction of this area.
So there will be a temporary impact during excavation while the ground is open, but the buffer will still be there. It will be smaller vegetation. If without mitigation or replanting, it would be potentially herbaceous instead of the large tree. So it has some potential to do a little less treatment. My understanding is most of the stormwater from the development goes through stormwater control measures. So the buffer is treating just backyard runoff, things like that. So from a water quality standpoint, I don't think that the impacts would be hard to be even identified. It's a fairly small area for such a big wooded area that's doing a lot of work to do water quality treatment.
But what's presented to us today is a situation that is really incompatible with both the way the town operates and the way the buffer program operates. Because it's, as you said, after the fact, a violation occurred, or the FEMA violation occurred. Construction was there. The town apparently saw no need to request any kind of a buffer variance on this when it was installed originally. Is that correct?
So it did not, nothing about the installation required any variance or buffer approval. This was approved prior to the Jordan buffer rules, and there were no additional impacts. What's being proposed now requires a variance, but the site is in compliance and has been in compliance with the regulations at the time of approval. Yeah, and you did ask about the environmental sensitivity. Again, the town was following the language in their ordinance, and so the language was the variance is consistent with the spirit, purpose, and intent of the ordinance. And then their findings of fact used the term environmentally sensitive. The town was considering the variance request presented to them, which was after the three options were considered. And so the town's process, they were considering the request to excavate in the buffer. So that is what was put before the town, is the request to do this excavation in the buffer, which is not something that's identified in the table of uses for the Jordan buffer rules. So that's why it's in front of you as a variance. It's not something that was ever perceived or conceived in the writing of the rules.
And just one more question before I turn to the other commissioners again. Is the inconsistency between the way the town ordinance came out with the way the board, it was supposed to be written for the buffer rule purposes, in the division's opinion, is that a big issue?
That is something we identified in this process, and the town is aware of it, and we are starting the process to make sure that they address that it does not match up.
It doesn't influence the division's evaluation of all of this.
So the division evaluated it based on, or provided findings based on the language in the Jordan buffer rule. So we weren't able, typically when we bring major variances that have come through a local government, we are able to just forward their findings of facts straightforward because they're line for line identical. So that's why there are two tables presented in this, provided in this presentation, is to show you the town went through their process, and then we went through with the Jordan buffer rules and identified each item in the Jordan buffer rules separately.
But as you pointed out, this is a unique situation in that there's construction already in the location. And the construction, it's not a common scenario for an evaluation of a variance request.
Yes, to be clear, what they're asking for hasn't occurred already, and everything on the ground is in compliance, but it is a unique situation where it's related to construction that's already in, and we're sort of thinking through things after doors are closed to us. Yeah.
Commissioner Sullivan, you said you had
Yeah,
two legal questions.
two on the legal front, because I mean, this is, on one hand, it seems not like a large area to disturb, but it is a major variance, and we have to follow what our ordinance says here. But the applicant did not purchase the property after August 2009, or before it. But yet, we say here that the effective date is because the plans were approved prior to 2009. So the ownership's changed according to this. So the property's been flipped since it was approved before 2009 to a different owner, and that owner is not the applicant, based on what this fact says here. So is a pre-approved plan transferable to future owners under our variance criteria? It doesn't seem, I thought in the past, just because the property was sold, doesn't mean you get the rights with the property before 2009. I guess that's my question.
I'm not sure I can fully answer the question about whether it's transferable, but Madam Chair, I think the impetus of the purchase requirement is that an individual doesn't purchase the property, know that it's subject to buffers, know that there are restrictions, and does so with the intent to purchase it and then ask for a variance, right? It's not just a strict requirement that you can't buy it after 2009. It's that you can't buy it after 2009, fully understanding what the restrictions are, and then say that you'll get no benefit from the property unless this is allowed in an effort to, for example, maximize profits. So it would seem to me that all of the pre-existing activities, as someone's pointed out, were permissible at the time that they took place, and that the only impetus for this variance request is that we're trying to correct a violation assessed by FEMA. So that I don't know that the ownership change necessarily impacts that requirement in terms of a timing process. It's looking at the activities now and what's required now.
I understand, and the spirit of the question is, it just says R. It's a major variance, and according to the record here, it says these conditions are met, and clearly the condition is the purchase of the property after 2009, and clearly we say here that it was purchased after 2009. But we can wink and nod, and it's okay because the plans were approved. I don't read that as how the ordinance. I'm just asking because I don't read that. I don't want to violate the ordinance if that's what we're considering.
Right, and as Ms. Holmes pointed out, the ordinance has some different language than what the rules contain, correct? I mean.
Yes, although that language is in the Jordan buffer rules.
Right, the language itself is in the Jordan buffer
Yes.
rules, and that's what I was talking about, the August 11, 2009. Well, I would love to be able to have enough brain capacity to remember that off the top of my head. It's actually I have the benefit of reading from the rule in front of me now.
And I'm gonna let you off the hook. I'm not throwing you. I know the spirit of things, and I know this is, again, it's small, but it's major. It's a major variance. We want to go by the rules.
Right, and so is your question whether that question has to be answered if it's not applicable?
It says R, and
Yeah.
clearly we acknowledge that the ownership of the record didn't change after 2009. So I'm just asking as a precedent and how we evaluate these things now and in the future. Does the owner after 2009 carry the rights? Because that's not what it reads. Is it out of the park off the bat because of that?
I can't swear to this, but my recollection is that you have in fact approved variances previously where the property was purchased after the effective date of the rules, but then an issue was discovered. And this one being a rare and unique issue is essentially what they're premising their variance request on. I don't know that it would be a strict bar to granting a variance because the property was purchased after 2009, because this is not the sort of strict or the typical type of scenario that we see where they purchase it after the fact and now they're trying to build on it or trying to develop it further and impacting the buffer for those purposes. I mean, the rules are full of, you know, that language such as the fact that you might get more profit from it is not a sufficient basis for granting variance. So there is some leeway there for the commission to find that either the condition is either not applicable or has been met because it's not applicable. And it would appear to me, that's a question you're going to have to answer for yourselves, but in thinking through it, I don't think that there's an absolute bar to a variance request based solely on the date of the purchase of the property under these circumstances. And I want to make it clear that under these circumstances, I don't think that date is an absolute bar.
So second question, that was the easier of the two. No. Well, it's related here, but C, condition C in the Jordan rule language is that it must have that finding of fact granting the variance. We say in C, or the department says in C, that it's not included by the town of Apex. And I guess it speaks to a little bit in the general case of what Chairman Deerhake was saying, that environmentally sensitive, that they have to make a statement about water quality and substantial justice has been done. They don't do that. So their definition of environmental sensitive is not defined in Apex to match this, and the statement's not provided. And then I guess part B, and where I was going maybe earlier, was that public safety and welfare, I've been assured as a licensed professional engineer, that's where I need to see those facts. But we acknowledge here, nobody's acknowledged that it's actually happened. Is that a game changer because they haven't provided that statement in Part C of the rules?
Right, so, Madam Chair, if I may, for Part C, just so we'll be on the same page, you're referring to 15A NCAC O2B 0267C.
C.
12C.
Right. On our slide,
yeah, which
16 in the record.
Which does require, it says, by its plain language, it says, for any variance request, the local government shall make a finding of fact as to whether, in granting the variance, the public safety and welfare have been assured, water quality has been protected, and substantial justice has been done. So that's an affirmative duty on the local government to make that finding. And if, in your review, you find that they did not make that finding, then that would be a basis to deny it, but it doesn't prohibit you from considering it. In other words, there's the bar from considering it, whether you have jurisdiction, et cetera, versus whether you can consider it and they haven't met those factors. So if in your estimation, based on the record in front of you, they have not made that statement, made that finding of fact and that determination, then you can use that and rely on that as a basis to vote to deny it. And I would assume that they would be able to make that, correct the record or add to the record to make sure that they just don't have it. If you haven't seen that in the record, it's not there.
Thank you.
Actually, so the second one was the easier of the two questions.
Yeah, maybe harder for me, but yeah.
Asking our counsel in a situation of denial like that, will the applicant be able to come back with another request to address the shortcomings of the application that we are before
sorry?
Do they have to wait a year?
I am not currently aware of a limit on time or number of attempts. And I'm looking for Sue because she's done a lot more of these, but I've read these
I believe
a number of
that-
times, and I don't remember them saying 3 strikes and you're out.
No.
Or you gotta wait so much time. It's that the town, having had their evidentiary hearing, it's really, this is not even a requirement on the applicant themselves. It's a review of whether the town has in fact met its obligations under the rules, right? Because it says the local government shall make a finding of fact as to this. So if the answer is,
Does that then end the process? Or we could approve this with conditions or make
Well,
conditions, but we on the same
And
page.
I'll ask council again, is deferral one option
So-
until we get the information that we're thinking we're missing today, including something in writing from FEMA about their opinion on the third option?
so if you take action today to deny the request based on the shortcomings, whether it be some additional information is needed or that the findings are incorrect, as long as you're making that decision based on the record and the requirements of the rules, if the town wish to take this issue up again and take new action or additional action to address the deficiencies identified by the commission, I don't see in the rules where they wouldn't be able to do that. I think what you're asking is whether there can be a remand, sort of in legal terms. That's what we look at, sort of like in the court of appeals, where there's been some error, it's being remanded back to address these issues. I don't see anything in the rules that would prohibit you from doing that, knowing though that even a remand back to the local government could be considered a denial and therefore could open it up for a further challenge. But I don't know that you would be prohibited from remanding it back to them with these deficiencies and having them address them and through the record and sending it back up. That they'll be responsible for ensuring that they do all of the processes that they would normally have to do in order to fill out that record to address those deficiencies. That would be incumbent upon the local government. But from what I'm gathering from the discussion at a minimum is that that there appears to be some deficiencies in the town's findings. And so asking them to,
In the record.
as well as the record, because they would need to make some kind of, they wouldn't be able to just come back and say, oh, let's add this sentence and that's it, right? They would have to have some type of, something in the record to support that finding.
And perhaps maybe in our decision, we can put the reasons.
Or you would have to absolutely,
Yeah,
you
as
would
far as-
absolutely
as far
have
as
to
what
put the
we're looking
reasons,
for.
whether, like, to deny it.
And a condition or perhaps a statement, that denied with.
Without
They can
prejudice.
have the option to review, or, not prejudicing.
Without prejudice, sort of.
Yeah, without prejudice.
The commission has found that, if this is in fact a vote, because you all have to make this decision by majority. I think, one, if it's to deny in any form, whether it's a denial / remand versus just a complete denial, you would need to state specifically what it is that you're doing and what you're asking them to correct, so that they can then take action to correct it should they choose to do so. I think they could also, again, not ruling out any other option, just that you would need to be specific in what basis, as to the basis of your action.
And
Let me take a moment and ask any other members of the committee if they have any comments or reaction. Commissioner Lyons?
I have one other question. So the information in the record, is it just the written information, or is it also what we've heard from the speakers here today?
So typically, the commission takes into consideration the presentations and the information provided, because that's intended to fill out the information.
Yeah.
It would not, for example, if the town were to appear and stand up and say, we hereby find, and then make the statement that's absent, that would not, in fact, be sufficient, in my view, to satisfy what, to be able to comply with those rules, because obviously the town has to act by its governing body, which would require a meeting and a majority vote, just like this body, right?
I'm wondering about the conversations with FEMA that, of course, they have not been done in writing.
Right, so, right, and there are some of the stuff that is in fact in the record that talks about option 3 a little bit, for some questions back and forth. But this body is entirely within its authority to find that's still not a sufficient basis to satisfy the requirements that the town is obligated to meet.
Okay.
There
Yeah,
was,
I mean,
there was quite a bit there, yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate the gentleman's candor and the fact that this doesn't seem to result in additional flood protection and results in actual environmental harm is kind of maddening. So that's where I'm at right now.
And I would think that if that's where the members are, and that's one of the reasons for denying and or remanding as well, that's what your view is, that will be what is reflected in the decision.
Yes.
Commissioner Duncan?
I agree with what Commissioner Mouse had just said. I think it's ridiculous. I think FEMA can issue its LOMAR and get rid of this insignificant violation. I'm uncertain as to what we're trying to protect. But we're actually doing further harm, I think, in my opinion, moving forward, just not only to the above surface impacts, but I think below it will have significant. I would hope that this commission would look to some type of way of remanding this matter back to the town of Apex to create, rectify any deficiencies that might be as part of this application process. But also some reach out to FEMA, by the divisions that kind of say, what the heck are we doing here? I don't understand why it's gotten to this point. I can understand trying to correct a FEMA violation. Of course, you don't want to get kicked out of the insurance plan as the town, and I get that. But that's a heavy stick for a non-impact, in my opinion.
Commissioner Davis?
Yes, ma'am. I also think I concur with some of the concerns that Commissioner Solomon had in the findings. The division's findings, one of the things that it says that the findings or the conditions are met. And in several areas, it does not meet, we do not meet the conditions, or the findings do not meet the conditions. And I understand the uniqueness of the situation, but if that's the reason, I think it should be documented that this is not an applicable situation, just not that the findings are not met, because we don't want to set a precedent going forward where we make a decision when findings are not met without documenting the uniqueness of the situation. Because without that, I think someone could challenge the fact that there have been times when findings were not met and we made a decision if we don't have that information included.
Thank you. Any additional questions or further discussion? Is the committee ready to think about making a motion on a decision?
One quick follow-up question. Go back to the slide number, was it? So there was slide number 12. The FEMA, I guess that's one thing. The FEMA violation was not created by the initial design and therefore not a result of the actions by the applicant, but rather resulted from a series of regulations. I don't really know how entirely correct that is. Any thoughts on that?
So this is the town's language. I think it was a case of, it's hard to match up the uniqueness of this situation with the language in the ordinance or the rule. So they were trying to
I noted that too.
match that up as best as you could.
And
Yeah.
I get that.
The variance language, I don't think ever perceived something like this needing a variance, so.
Chair will entertain a motion. If council,
Just, you know, it would be helpful to maybe, if you want me to go over the factors are.
certainly, our council will review the factors that are usually considered in our decision making.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to point out that under 12, so this is still O2B dash, or point 0267, we're in 12 with variances. And what it requires is that, that the local government prepare the preliminary findings and submit to the commission for approval. And that included among the variance requests that for request, the local government shall make findings of fact whether there are practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships that prevent compliance with riparian buffer protection requirements. A finding of practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships shall require that the following conditions are met. The applicant complies with the provisions of the rule. He or she can secure no reasonable return from nor make reasonable use of his or her property, merely providing that the variance would permit greater profit from the property shall not be considered as adequate justification for variance. Moreover, the local government shall consider whether the variance is the minimum possible deviation from the terms of this rule that shall make reasonable use of the property possible. In some of these, in the discussion, you all are suggesting that maybe they're not applicable, but that's how that's viewed. 2 is that the hardship results from the application of this rule to the property rather than from other factors such as deed restrictions or other hardships. 3, the hardship is due to the physical nature of the applicant's property, such as the size, shape, or topography, such that compliance with the provisions of this rule would not allow reasonable use of the property. 4, the applicant did not cause the hardship by knowingly or unknowingly violating this rule. 5, the applicant did not purchase the property after August 11, 2009, the effective date of this rule, and then request a variance, and hardship is rare or unique to the property, to the applicant's property. B says that the local government shall make findings of fact as to whether the variance is in harmony with the general purpose and intent of the state's riparian buffer protection requirements and preserves the spirit. And C is that for variance request, any variance request, the local government shall make a finding of fact whether in granting the variance the public safety and welfare have been assured, the water quality has been protected, and substantial justice has been done. So that's what your rules talk about in terms of variance requests and what's required of both the applicant and the local government.
Can you give us the citation again on the variance?
Sure.
Criteria.
Sure. So the rule that I just read from, is 15, yeah, right there, 15A, O2B, 0267, sub 12. And that is the Jordan Water Supply Nutrient Strategy and Protection of Existing Riparian Buffers. That's that formal name of the rule.
Is your laptop set up that you could pull up those and put it on the screen for us? The internet?
Oh, from the internet?
Read those
I can sure try.
decision-making points. Be helpful to have it in front of us.
Oh, thank you. Need glasses.
Hit the plus sign 2 or 3 more times.
Okay, you'll just have to tell me when to scroll down for you.
Okay. I get dizzy looking at that way.
Does that work?
Yes, I can read it from here. You scroll down, please. Where is the reference to Public Welfare Council?
See it. It also includes your water quality discussions too.
Okay. That seems to be most pointed to your concern, my concern.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there's a lot of assumptions here. We know this is not big, but it is a major, and we do have clear language that says shall. So it looks to me like subpart A, little I, as Commissioner Duggan said, may not be met because it's already in play. I don't see where the hardship's been identified, the reasonable use of the property that's already in use, and we don't have information about the alternatives enough to know whether it's reasonable or not in the record. I think the other way to deny it would be Part A, number 5, again, back to, did they purchase the property after August 11th? And in our record, it says they did. And then I think it would be subpart C, which is that statement from the local government. I mean, that would be, to me, grounds for denial. But again, I would like to think, like the town thinks, that this hopefully is not a major thing, but then, as Commissioner Monstead said, why are we even doing it if it's not a major thing there?
So I think we have enough places in the criteria to point if we want to formulate or craft a motion of some kind. So the chair would welcome a motion from any of the members. Commissioner Jones.
Do we know kind of what is going to be the impact, if we deny this, the impact that it would create below for the town? Like, you know, is then, where does FEMA come in at that point? FEMA, you know, I certainly don't want necessarily our decision to impact a flood insurance program, right? And I don't know if there's.
In my opinion, I think if we phrase it as a remand and not a final, basically not a final decision, we're giving them the opportunity to.
If I may, Madam Chair,
Yes.
so the rule technically says the EMC has to deny or approve with stipulations. In having earlier conversations with the town about their process and their ordinance and variance process, it may be necessary to actually deny so that they can restart their process. Because we had conversations about whether they could modify some of their findings after their Board of Adjustments, and their response back was that that wasn't something they could do, but possibly upon an actual denial, that would give them that ability to restart their process. So I'm not sure a remand would work for them. That would be a legal question, but their legal counsel isn't here, so.
And is there a year, I know in some jurisdictions, is a year wait before you could refile your.
There is nothing in the buffer rule that would prevent them from coming back as soon as they could go through their internal process and provide us with a package that has the items addressed. It may take them some time to revise their ordinance and then go through it to make sure it has everything you are requesting, but there's no set time frame. They could come back as fast as they could do that, should they choose to.
Thank you. Yes, Councilman.
I was just going to mention that when I was discussing in terms of remand, it was more of a air quotes, finger, air quotes here, remand, meaning that you're asking that, you're specifying, you're inviting, and that's perfectly within your right to invite them to make the, you know, to resubmit this information under those conditions, but as I noted, that even a quote-unquote remand would likely be challengeable in and of itself. So I didn't mean to use my language too loosely, because Ms. Homewood is correct that the rule does say that you approve the conditions and stipulations or deny the request. It's how you decide to draft those rules. You as a commission draft it.
Well, thank you both for clarifying that.
Chair?
Yes, Commissioner Miles.
It sounds like we're all kind of coming to the same place, but I agree that a denial would allow for two things. One, for the town to complete its information, because I don't think all the information is bad, they're just looking at some pieces. And two, perhaps for a further conversation with FEMA, and maybe we don't have to deal with this again.
All right, thank you. I agree. I think the fact that if the town went back to FEMA and said, we need this in writing, but that would also be an opportunity to continue discussion about the concerns that are raised here. And maybe FEMA would reconsider its position. Motion.
Madam Chair, I make a motion to deny the approval for the variance based upon 15A NCAC 02B.026712.
Sorry.
12A, as well as little I, little b, for 12A4, and 12A5, as well as 12C, if the application does not fulfill the obligations of the regulations.
What was Roman numeral 4 again? I don't remember having our conversation about that. The applicant did not cause hardship by knowingly or unknowingly violating this rule. Okay.
There's insufficient evidence to demonstrate.
Do I have a second on that motion? Thank you for the motion, Commissioner Blake. Do I hear a second?
Second?
Second by Commissioner Morris. Any further discussion on this request or the motion?
I'm not sure I completely agree with 4, but I'll go. There's enough in there that we can list it.
Okay.
Sorry, Madam Chair.
Yes, Council Bill.
I just wanted to mention that.
Council Reynolds.
Please forgive me, because I didn't speak out loud or tell you what you all think, but I wasn't sure if was it little, going at 4 or 2 about the hardship?
It was 2, not 4, I'm sorry.
That being that the hardship results from the application of this rule to the property rather than from other factors such as deed restrictions or other hardships. And I could be wrong with that, so please don't take my question as anything other than I want to make sure I have it right correctly. Like your desire in order.
Actually, it's amend my motion for 12A1 to 12A5 as well as 12C. And we're moving 2 and 4.
Okay, gotcha.
Little 1, little 5.
And 12C. That's right.
Commissioner Miles, are you agreeable to that amendment? The amendment is to remove I, Roman numeral 4, from his motion. That would only leave A1 and C.
Okay.
No, A1, A5.
Excuse me, A1, A5, and A6. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah.
Okay, we have an amended motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would somebody step out in the hall and see if Mr. McAdams is outside waiting so he can rejoin? Okay. So that ends our action item section of today, and the next portion is an information item. And we have one semi-annual progress report on 1,4-dioxane in the Cape Fear River Basin, presented by Jenny Graceneck and Michael Montebello, Division of Water Resources.
Yeah, that's right. Hello.
Hello, welcome. I think that's Mr. Montebello.
No, it's not. I'm Jenny Graceneck. I'm with the Winston-Salem Regional Office of Division of Water Resources. Mike Montebello was supposed to be here presenting this with me today, but yesterday he had 2 emergency root canals,
Oh my gosh.
and I don't think he wanted to open his mouth today. So filling in for him is Nick Coco, who is a permitting engineer for the Division of Water Resources in the Municipal Permitting Unit. So I will be presenting my section first, and then we'll hand it over to Nick. To continue, so this is the semi-annual progress report on 1,4-dioxane in the Cape Fear River Basin. These semi-annual progress reports are required as part of the Greensboro Special Order by consent as settlement agreement. And also, as part of this report, note that there was also a requirement for an annual written report, and that is in the materials that you have for the meeting. Just going. All right, so today's presentation will include these topics listed. I will discuss the division's ongoing and planned surface water and discharge sampling efforts, including some results of those efforts. Then Nick will speak on the identification of point source dischargers of 1,4-dioxane in the Cape Fear River Basin upstream of drinking water intakes, as well as provide an update on the actions that DEQ is taking to reduce 1,4-dioxane concentrations in the basin, including incorporation of limits into NPDES permits, and an explanation of DEQ's reasoning and an expected timeline of completion for those activities. So I'll begin by discussing the sampling efforts by the division. So this table here, or this graph, shows why we keep coming back to the Cape Fear River Basin when it comes to 1,4-dioxane. This graph depicts the maximum reported 1,4-dioxane concentration of 23 POTWs, based on the results from a survey that the division did in 2019. You'll notice that the facilities with the highest concentrations are circled in red on the screen. And that's Ashboro, Reedsville, and Greensboro, obviously all in the Cape Fear River Basin. All of these facilities are in the Cape Fear River Basin, though. And we will be discussing those facilities with the high concentrations today in more detail. So let's start by talking about some of DWR's surface water sampling. The division began screening for 1,4-dioxane in 2014 and 2015. In 2017, an approved analytical method for
Surface water and wastewater became available, and the division secured funding and was able to get some lab equipment to analyze 1,4-dioxane on their own. The division continued to monitor in the Cape Fear River Basin and expanded monitoring into the Yadkin and Neuse. The percentage and magnitude of 1,4-dioxane detections has decreased over time in the Cape Fear River Basin, except for some of the known and occasional spikes that have occurred. And you can see that in this table. In other river basins, 1,4-dioxane has not been detected or was rarely detected and at a much lower concentration. In 2021, 1,4-dioxane was added to the analyte list for DWR's statewide random ambient monitoring system. 30 new stations were established in January 2020 and monitored every other month for 2 years. In 2021, DWR sampled 1,4-dioxane at an average of 59 surface water locations monthly. And in 2023, monthly monitoring will continue for the Cape Fear River Basin, but also the Neuse and Yadkin. And 2022 data will be added to our publicly accessible online dashboard. And then the 30 random stations that were sampled last year will be deactivated, and 30 new randomly selected stations will be activated. So in addition to the sampling that's done by the division's water sciences section that I just described, the Winston-Salem Regional Office, where I'm located, began collecting weekly grab and composite effluent samples at these POTWs that showed the highest concentrations downstream of their dischargers. And I'll describe that in the next several slides. So this is Greensboro first. Our office started sampling at Greensboro's T.Z. Osborne wastewater treatment plant in October 2019. After, you may remember, an effluent concentration of 957.5 micrograms per liter was reported on their August 2019 discharge monitoring report. Our sampling at T.Z. Osborne continued through April 2021, when the original SOC became effective and the city took over sampling as it was stipulated in that agreement. So please note that this graph stops in April 2021, and so it doesn't look as if there has been much progress. However, you'll see in further graphs that effluent concentrations have decreased since then. So you'll see that soon. Next is Reedsville. We began sampling at Reedsville wastewater treatment plant in October 2019, the same month. Reedsville has one SIU that has significantly reduced their 1,4-dioxane concentrations over the last several years through source reduction and product substitution. You can see that in this graph and how it has impacted their data. Our sampling at Reedsville is ongoing, weekly. Next is Burlington. We did some short-lived sampling at Burlington starting in November 2019. That sampling only lasted until April 2020 because Burlington entered into an agreement with the Haw River Assembly that included routine sampling for PFAS and 1,4-dioxane. Next, High Point. We started sampling at High Point Eastside Wastewater Treatment Plant in June 2022 after high concentrations were noted on their discharge monitoring reports. High Point has identified one significant industrial user that they are starting to work with to reduce some of these peaks that you see there. And sampling at High Point is ongoing for our office. And finally, Asheboro. We started collecting weekly grab and composite samples at Asheboro Wastewater Treatment Plant in July 2021 for the same reason I've described, after seeing some high concentrations on their monitoring reports. Asheboro has a significant industrial user with installed treatment for 1,4-dioxane, and now that treatment has been installed at that industry, they were able to see that they had also some incoming 1,4-dioxane concentrations from their county landfill. That's what they're dealing with now. So sampling at Asheboro is ongoing, and Nick actually will discuss later that the Asheboro MPDS permit draft is currently out for public notice. That ends on Friday. Also, I want to note that at the end of this presentation, I have some extra slides of data, of graphs. That's data from the POTWs themselves. Because my office staff goes and collects this data every week, every municipality splits samples with us, so they are also reporting their own data. So I have that data at the end, if you're interested in seeing that. All right, so now let's briefly review the Greensboro Special Order by Consent for 1,4-dioxane. So just to remind everyone, the original SOC was approved by the EMC in March 2021 with an effective date of May 1, 2021. That was originally for a 2-year SOC with a year 1 compliance value of 45 micrograms per liter and a year 2 compliance value of 33 micrograms per liter. The Fayetteville Public Works Commission and the Haw River Assembly filed legal petition against that SOC in April 2021. And due to those settlement negotiations, an amended SOC was approved by the EMC in November 2021. And that effective date for that was December 1, 2021. So the outcome of that was a 3-year SOC with lower compliance values. Year 1, 35, year 2, 31.5, and year 3, 23 micrograms per liter. And of course, as I've stated, part of that settlement included the requirement for these semi-annual progress reports to the Water Quality Committee on the SOC and on DEQ's 1,4-dioxane actions, which is why we're here. So the city's current SOC monitoring plan includes 58 sampling sites, including the addition of all of the city's significant industrial users and their discharges, as well as the town of Pittsboro's raw water intake. Greensboro sends its weekly effluent 1,4-dioxane grab samples for rush laboratory analysis to allow faster notification to those downstream users, including, which is Pittsboro. Well, that's the first downstream community. As part of the city's ongoing investigation into recent SOC exceedances, continuous composite samplers remain at 4 collection system trunk line locations. Samples are collected from those continuous samplers twice per week. As part of the SOC settlement agreement negotiations, Greensboro conducts 1,4-dioxane composite sampling and analyses for each of the 32 significant industrial user discharges, once in consecutive quarters in all 3 years of the SOC. The city requires all of those industries on the patent trunk line with concentrations of 1,4-dioxane that's greater than 15 micrograms per liter to collect and retain daily and weekly composite samples. Remember, we're concerned about the patent trunk line because that's the trunk line that was identified as the section of the collection system where the recent exceedance has occurred. So in year 1, any SIU with a 1,4-dioxane concentration of greater than 100 micrograms per liter was required to investigate 1,4-dioxane and report findings back to the city. Greensboro was able to identify 9 SIUs with a discharge greater than 100 micrograms per liter. And that threshold was reduced to 31.5 in year 2, which we are now in year 2, and will further reduce to 23 in year 3, and that begins, shockingly, May 1, 2023. So if you remember from my presentation in July, Lanxess, formerly Lanxess, is an organic chemical manufacturer that was recently sold to a new company named Hallstar. They were determined to be the source of the 1,4-dioxane April 2022 SOC exceedance. At that time, Lanxess identified a product that generated 1,4-dioxane as an unintended reaction byproduct during the manufacturing process. The SDS sheet's review of raw materials of that product did not indicate any presence of 1,4-dioxane. It was typically only produced once a year. They also identified a sister product that was manufactured 1 to 2 times a year that could also have the potential to generate 1,4-dioxane. Manufacture of those suspected products at the Greensboro facility was halted until further notice. However, anytime you see the ... you know that we have foreshadowing. And unfortunately, the city received a 1,4-dioxane result of 8.4 micrograms per liter for an effluent grab sample that was collected on October 25th of last year. That number does not represent an exceedance of the year 2 SOC compliance value, which is 31.5. However, city staff knew that it was slightly higher than normal, and so they decided to investigate. The patent trunk line surveillance sample result from that week was 27.3, which is elevated considering what it usually is at that spot. So the city required those previously identified patent trunk line SIUs to submit for analysis their weekly composite samples that they were holding, as you'll remember, that they're required to retain. So Hallstar, who's that new owner of the former Lanxess, ended up reporting significantly higher than normal daily as well as weekly composite results during that time period. The city discovered in their investigation that Hallstar attempted to manufacture one of those halted products and attempted to capture all of the resulting wastewater, but some was obviously ultimately released to the collection system. So the city has a local pollutant allocation for Hallstar, just as they did for Lanxess and all the other SIUs. And according to the industry's daily composite sample from Hallstar, they exceeded that on October 20th. Excuse me. The city is currently pursuing enforcement action based on this exceedance. They're in the middle of that process right now. And the city was obviously very surprised that this happened. And that enforcement action is ongoing, and we will provide an update to you all, to the Water Quality Committee, on those actions in our next report. But I will say that the city's voluntary investigation of only a slightly elevated effluent sample did result in this discovery, thankfully. They were able to combine the effluent data, collection system, surveillance sampling, as well as the SIU sampling that they require to determine where that elevated concentration came from. Based on that information, it appears, we feel like, that the SOC process and other voluntary efforts by the city are working. And I just wanted to show you, this is Greensboro's data, and it's a little different from the previous graph that I showed where the data ended April 2021. This shows data up until November of 2022, and it does show consistently that that concentrations are decreasing due to the effectiveness of the SOC. That's the end of my portion, and I'm gonna hand it over to...
Would you like questions at this stage or wait until completion of both of you?
Well, that's up to you. Either way.
The members willing to wait to see everything first? Okay.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Hi. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the identification of point source dischargers of 1,4-dioxane in the Cape Fear River Basin. This slide and the next slide are going to provide a list to you of NPDES permits that have been issued at this point with 1,4-dioxane requirements and conditions. As you'll see, the majority of them are monitoring requirements. This allows us to get an idea of just how much contribution of 1,4-dioxane each of these discharges is providing to the streams. But as you note, the radiator specialty permit, we did provide, based on the Class C in-stream target value, a limit of 80 micrograms per liter. This slide here provides a list of NPDES permits that are currently out for public comment with 1,4-dioxane requirements and conditions. Again, following suit, majority of these are for monitoring requirements, with the exception of the Asheboro wastewater treatment plant, which, as Jenny had alluded to earlier, does have its comment period ending this Friday, though I've been told this morning there's a chance that that's going to be pushed back based on comments received on this permit to the 27th. And that permit I'll discuss in a little bit more detail later. This list here are a list of permits that NPDES municipal unit staff are preparing at this very moment that will have 1,4-dioxane requirements. This, you'll see, is just a couple monitoring only, and the rest will be limit requirements. And again, if you look through this group, you're going to see most of them are the ones that Jenny had identified earlier in this presentation that have had elevated levels of 1,4-dioxane. So now we'll provide a quick update on DEQ actions to reduce 1,4-dioxane concentrations in the Cape Fear River Basin. as promised, we'll start with Ashboro. So Ashboro has been submitted out for public comment with final limitations. This permit was presented with a 5-year phased compliance schedule that provides 2 interim limitations as well as a final limitation, and that final limit is based off of the 0.35 in-stream target value for water supply waters. Please note that this permit had initially been submitted for public comment in 2018. However, based on comments received that requested that the department and the division consider downstream water supply intakes, this has resulted in a change in the limits. Here's just a graph showing Ashboro's data, and it does kind of tell the story a little bit that Jenny was saying earlier. You know, in 2019, when we're looking at the data, you've got these high peaks, and if you go back even past the into early 2019, 2018, you would see that that data is quite high during that time. At that point, their industrial user that they had identified as a 1,4-dioxane discharger into their influent had implemented technology which allowed them to find that they had another industrial user, this time a landfill, that also has 1,4-dioxane present. To provide an update on recent actions, we have updated the 1,4-dioxane permitting strategy, and we have put that on the Emerging Compounds website, which is publicly available, alongside other related information. Some additional next steps. We are currently addressing the next group of NPDES permits that would be expected to have effluent limits for 1,4-dioxane. We are taking this permitting process in a stepwise approach, and we are prioritizing permits based on both sampling results and discharge location, putting priority on facilities that are either discharging to or upstream of water supply intakes. In addition, we are reviewing the chemical addendum sheets that are provided by municipalities in their NPDES permit applications. So a brief explanation of DEQ's actions, reasoning, and the expected time for completion. Here is a table that lists out the permits that are currently being developed by the NPDES municipal unit permit writing staff, as well as the drafting status. Again, you'll notice that these are the same ones that Jenny had discussed earlier, that we have conducted enough study into to determine that they are discharging elevated levels that need to be permitted for. The draft permits for the cities of Burlington, High Point, which includes an expansion, and Reedsville will be discussed with each permittee. That is due to the fact that each of these permits will require the use of a compliance schedule, and per EPA's requirements for compliance schedules, we need to work with the municipalities in order to develop the most expeditious compliance schedule possible so that we can come into compliance with the permit limits and protect public health as soon as we can. A summary of these discussions and the progress with these permits will be submitted with the next semi-annual report in 2023. And the process is going to be very similar to what was done with Greensboro and Ashboro. So some next steps, again, we are going to need to get to a point where we're assessing treatment technologies for permittees that have NPDES permit limits that might require something that's equivalent to best available technology, acknowledging that best available technology is not a one-size-fits-all system. It could vary from industry type to industry type. Municipalities will be working with their SIUs to assess alternatives, such as product substitution or relocation of specific manufacturing products. And in the future, emerging compounds don't seem to be going away. So things like PFAS, the PFAS family of compounds, will be addressed. In December 5th of 2022, the EPA had provided us with a new guidance regarding monitoring for PFAS. We will discuss things further in the next semi-annual report, and I guess now we'll open up the floor for questions.
Thank you for filling in for Mr. Montebello, and we wish him our very best.
Thanks.
Any questions from the committee members for Ms. Grace Eckerly? Mr. Coco? Yes, Commissioner Saul.
This may be for either of you or for the division director. It's not uncommon when you do the root cause analysis, and here we've kind of had 2 investigations you guys have done, and you put all this in place. What is your strategy for keeping this going over the long term? I mean, is it going to revert back to the permittees to track it? Or will you guys do you have a line item budget and intention to keep doing your grab samples and those type of things for several years? How do you stay focused is the question.
That's a good question. And I think as we get these, as we get 1,4-dioxane put into permits, it will put more of the responsibility onto the permittee, onto the facilities. Part of the reason that our office starts this sampling, that if we go do it, we know they will split samples with us, and it requires them to do weekly sampling, and it gets us more data points. It is difficult for us, certainly with staffing, to try to get staff out there because we've got somebody right now every Friday who goes to 3 different sites. We did hand that over to Greensboro, and that took off one facility, but then we added Ashboro and we added High Point. But I think at the point when we are able to add the monitoring requirements that forces them to monitor it themselves into the permit, so at that point, I think we won't necessarily need to go out there and sample every week.
I think that would be good to maybe add a future report, just that transition,
Okay.
that formal transition, because we could help you get more resources if needed, or just acknowledge that you guys feel like it's moving over formally in case something
Okay.
else happens.
Thank you. That's a good point.
Others? I have a few questions. Thank you for the details. On the Greensboro incident with the change in ownership, unannounced, I guess it might be, and experimentation with that product line again, is this, the way the city is handling this, is they're not prohibiting the production of the product, but they're rather just monitoring the discharge into the system, or how are they handling it?
So it was prohibited with that previous company. I believe all assumed that when it handed over to new hands, that would exist, would continue to exist. I guess that, and as far as I know, I think that new company understood that, because they did go through this process and realized they needed to collect the wastewater. I think their attempt was that no one would know, but unfortunately some did.
The difference between prohibiting production versus prohibiting discharge, it was prohibiting production.
Well, I don't know. I would have to ask if they prohibited production. I believe that they were going to cease manufacturing. So I would take that to mean that they were not going to make those products. And then therefore that company, not therefore, but then very soon after, that company sold to a new company, and they decided to go on and do it anyway.
Well, I think that's a very important lesson learned for everyone. Don't you agree?
Yes, so I think going forward, it is going to be, I know that Greensboro has not been able to talk about it very much because they definitely have their legal counsel involved, as well as the company, because they're taking this very seriously and plan to proceed with a very significant enforcement action against this company. And they are following up with a written agreement to make sure that this won't happen again.
And in the listing of all the permitting that's going on, and thank you for sharing all that, it's apparent that the permit conditions are varying from one wastewater treatment source to another, whether they be municipal or county or private industry. Is there no consistent discharge limit? I mean, is that calculated unique to the plant itself? If you could give us more information about how you arrive at those permit conditions for effluent discharge limits.
Yeah, of course. So when we go about creating a permit limit in any permit, what we'll do is we'll consider reasonable potential to have an excursion above a standard EPA recommended value or in-stream target value. And when we calculate the allowable discharge concentration based on each of those numbers, we take into consideration the stream flow, so the stream statistics. In this case, for a carcinogen, it would be the annual average flow. And then we would also take into consideration in the calculation how much is being contributed flow-wise from the plant. And we, to be conservative, we would take the actual permitted flow, not the average daily flow or what have you. And that's how we come up with the number. And that's why it varies from facility to facility, even if we're using the same standard in-stream target value, et cetera.
For the benefit of our two new committee members, could you please refresh our memory about what the state standard is that's driving the number that you calculate?
Sure. So this is a narrative standard, which essentially says no toxics and toxic amounts. We're going to boil it down. And it is to develop based on an in-stream target value, which are numbers that we've used before for other parameters. And we use that to come up with what we would consider toxic. And because it's a carcinogen, toxicity takes into consideration different things such as the annual average flow. And through just a standard calculation, we would come up with an allowable discharge concentration.
I'm trying to remember, is this aquatic life toxicity or is it human?
This is human health.
Human
This would be
health.
so this is a carcinogen. Yeah, it's human health.
And could you elaborate more on the monthly monitoring? What type of, is the monitoring varying from one plant to another as well, the monitoring practices?
Monitoring, so the method that's being used probably does not vary at all from plant to plant, but the frequency can vary based on what we've seen. If we have data, if we don't have data, if we've got a limited data set and we want to find out more, or in some cases we have a robust data set, and that's where you'd end up with a situation where there's a limit involved. And right now, when we're applying a limit for 1,4-dioxane, we're also putting in weekly monitoring, which is part of our 1,4-dioxane strategy.
And everyone's using the same analytical method, right? And that there are probably just a limited number of commercial labs that do the work. And they are being sent to certified labs that.
Right. There are a few that they use because they're all congregated in the same area. They're pretty much using the same lab, and they are using they're required to use the same method. And just to make a point that all these facilities we were discussing were required to monitor monthly, according to a 2019 administrative letter. And so that will change with the permit going to weekly. And that's a part of the reason that we decided to sample weekly from our office, just to give us more data.
Great, okay. Is there anything in the permits for the communities other than Greensboro that deals with managing the significant industrial users in a fashion similar to the way that we prescribed in the settlement, the SOC?
No, go ahead.
At this point, so the SOC kind of operates of its own volition. It was decided upon differently. With the way that municipalities work with their industries, it's through their approved pre-treatment programs. But the way that pre-treatment programs set situational limits for their industries, they do that once a permit limit is set, pretty much. So they would go based off of what the state is identifying as an acceptable or allowable discharge, and then they would back calculate to say what is a allowable loading into the plant from their approved industries.
But I hope you agree that some, I think, very beneficial models on how the towns can work with their SIUs were established with the SOC that could be beneficial to
Absolutely.
the other communities.
Definitely. I mean, I know that Greensboro has learned a lot. We've learned a lot from this process. And these communities do, they have regular meetings with each other where I know that they are trading information back and forth, which is beneficial. But, Greensboro has gone, as we know, above and beyond and done a lot of things that are not required. So do we know if other municipalities will do that going forward? No. But yes, I agree. We have learned a lot about working with their SIUs and methods of investigating where 1,4-dioxane sources are.
If I may, there is a pre-treatment association with these, so that would be a potential topic we could have come in and speak to the committee about what they do and how they connect.
That'd be great. In slide 29, we have a fourth bullet. It said you're reviewing chemical addendum information being provided with NPDES permit applications. Could you expand on that a bit? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, the chemical addendum is a requirement that was through, you'll have to forgive me off the top of my head, I don't know which session law, but it essentially is a requirement that should a facility conduct sampling that's outside of their permit's traditional requirements, that is using an approved method, an EPA-approved method, they should be reporting that in their renewal application to the division saying, we have sampled for this parameter, we found that it was detected at this level, or we found that it was not detected, and we review that information just to keep track of what could potentially be there other than what we're already requiring.
So is this a vehicle for having facilities work with you in the permitting process to identify emerging chemicals that could potentially be found in their wastewater? I've always thought it would be helpful as the emerging chemical issues arose to have a better way of requiring wastewater treatment facilities to look for the types of operations that are discharging to their systems so that they know if there is a subset of popular topics, popular list of emerging chemicals that they need to watch for and keep y'all informed about.
So what I will say is that this particular tool is primarily for approved methodologies, and when an approved method is given to us by EPA or is gone through all the rigmarole to get there, these compounds have likely already emerged. So I would say it would need a refinement and adjustment in that regard, but that's my 2 cents. Maybe not speaking for the division.
Anyone else have questions? Yes, Chair Smith.
Just one quick question. Back on the Greensboro situation and the SIUs being required to hold samples. So it sounds like when Greensboro saw a slight elevation, they did the right thing and looked into that. But is there nothing that requires the individual SIU to notify the wastewater treatment plant if they see something in those samples?
So they're holding those samples, they're not analyzing all of them.
That was my question.
Yeah.
If there are no other questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That completes our agenda of presentations today. For the two new members, I keep an unofficial or working document list of items of interest to committee members. If any of you would like to pass any ideas along to me, I can add those too. And we'll be glad to share with you what the current version looks like. Director Rogers, welcome. Do you have any comments you'd like to make?
I do not. I would just like to follow up on Commissioner Solom's comment about the POTW Association, North Carolina Water Quality Association. We're in close contact with them, and they're in close contact with us on this issue. So we have ongoing discussion about this as well. So I think it is a good idea for y'all to get updated on our efforts there, and perhaps have them come in and talk about it as well.
Yeah, and if I may, just for clarity, I was talking more about the pre-treatment association.
Yes.
There's a lot, not the North Carolina Water Quality.
Well, they have a
Association.
pre-treatment group as well that they're very interested in.
Okay. Yeah, mine was more toward pre-treatment.
I got you, absolutely.
Okay, tomorrow we will have a couple of items on the full EMC agenda. One will be the lab certification for amendments. And we'll have a presentation on the results of a public hearing on reclassifying 11 waters in the Watauga Basin. So just for your information. Any comments from the committee members? If not, we are adjourned, and the next meeting will be in March. Watch for the date and time. Thank you.
Thank you.